Welcome to this journey through one of the most unsettling cases recorded in the history of Kansas. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The year was 1868. The Kansas prairie stretched endlessly under vast, indifferent skies. In the small settlement of Ellsworth, about 60 miles west of Abilene, the railroads were pushing through, bringing with them the promise of prosperity and the certainty of change. The town existed in that liminal space between wilderness and civilization, a place where the rules of society were still being negotiated, often with violence. To understand the environment that allowed Sarah Hollander's activities to go undetected for so long, one must first understand the Kansas of 1868. The state was barely 7 years old, having joined the Union in January 1861, just months before the outbreak of the Civil War. The conflict had taken a particularly brutal form in Kansas, where pro-slavery and abolitionist forces had been fighting their own bloody war since the 1850s. This period, known as Bleeding Kansas, had left deep scars on the territory and its people. Post-war Kansas was a place of opportunity and danger in equal measure. The Homestead Act of 1862 had opened vast tracts of land to settlement, drawing people from the war-ravaged East and immigrants from Europe. The railroad companies were pushing their tracks westward, creating instant towns wherever they established stations. The cattle drives from Texas brought both commerce and chaos to the new settlements along the route. It was against this backdrop of expansion and lawlessness that Sarah Hollander arrived in Ellsworth County. The town itself was still in its infancy, having been established as a railway depot and cattle shipping point in 1867. Named after Lieutenant Allen Ellsworth, who had surveyed the area for the Union Pacific Railroad, the settlement consisted initially of little more than a few wooden buildings, tents, and dugouts carved into the hillsides. On the outskirts of town, at the end of a rutted dirt road, stood a modest cabin. Locals called it the Widow's Place, an unassuming structure of weathered wood and stone chimney. Smoke perpetually curled from that chimney, even in the warmest days of summer. The smell that accompanied it was peculiar, rich and savory, yet with an underlying odor that made horses skittish when riders passed too close. The cabin had been built by a homesteader named Jebediah Tuttle in 1864. According to county records, Tuttle and his family had abandoned the property after a harsh winter and Indian troubles in 1865, selling it for a fraction of its worth to a woman newly arrived from the East. That woman was Sarah Hollander. Sarah had arrived in Ellsworth County in the spring of 1865, shortly after the war ended. She came alone, a striking figure in black, her face partially obscured by a heavy veil. The story she told was simple enough. Her husband, a Union soldier, had fallen at Petersburg. With no children and no prospects in her native Ohio, she had come west to start anew. She paid cash for the small cabin and its 5 acres of land, a transaction recorded in the county ledger on April 17, 1865. The entry in the ledger, viewable today in the Kansas State Archives, is notable for its precision. Most land transactions of the era were recorded with minimal detail, but this one includes the exact amount paid, $42.50, the boundaries of the property described in careful detail, and the full legal name of the purchaser, Sarah Elizabeth Hollander, widow of Captain James Hollander, 105th Ohio Volunteer Infantry. This attention to detail would later be recognized as characteristic of Sarah's methodical nature, a nature that extended to all aspects of her life, including the selection and processing of her victims. But at the time, it simply marked her as unusually educated and particular for a frontier woman. From the beginning, there was something about the widow that kept people at a distance. She wasn't unfriendly, quite the opposite. Sarah Hollander was known for her hospitality, particularly to weary travelers who found themselves on her doorstep. Her stew was legendary, a savory concoction that she claimed contained 27 herbs and spices, a family recipe. What made it remarkable was not just its flavor, but its availability. Somehow, the widow always had meat, even during the harshest winters when others in the settlement went without. The preservation of meat was a significant challenge on the frontier. Without reliable refrigeration, most settlers depended on smoking, salting, or drying techniques that were often inadequate against the extremes of the Kansas climate. Yet the widow's pot never seemed to empty, and the meat within it never showed signs of spoilage, even in the heat of summer. This abundance did not go unnoticed, though the explanations offered were innocent enough. Some suggested she had a secret arrangement with hunters or soldiers from Fort Harker, located about 12 miles to the northeast. Others believed she had perfected a preservation method that allowed her to store game through the changing seasons. No one considered a more sinister source for her larder. The town of Ellsworth was rapidly changing in those years. What had once been little more than a collection of log structures along the Smoky Hill Trail was transforming with the coming of the Kansas Pacific Railway. New buildings of milled lumber appeared almost weekly. The sound of hammers and saws competed with the constant lowing of cattle being driven up from Texas. Money flowed freely, as did whiskey and blood. The Kansas Pacific had reached Ellsworth in July 1867, instantly elevating the settlement from a way stop to a transportation hub. With the railroad came lumber and manufactured goods from the east, allowing for more substantial construction than had previously been possible. Within months, the main street boasted a hotel, a bank, several saloons, and a general store, all built to replace the canvas and sod structures that had initially served these functions. Simultaneously, Joseph McCoy's Great Western Stockyards was established in Abilene, drawing massive cattle herds up the Chisholm Trail from Texas. Some of these herds passed near Ellsworth, bringing cowboys with money to spend and a thirst for entertainment after months on the dusty trail. By 1868, Ellsworth was beginning to develop its own stockyards, setting the stage for it to eventually replace Abilene as a major shipping point for Texas cattle. Amidst this chaos of growth, few paid much attention to the quiet widow who kept to herself. Those who encountered her described a woman of remarkable composure, tall and straight-backed with a formal manner of speaking that suggested education beyond what was common on the frontier. Her hands, several noted, were unusually strong for a woman, with long fingers that she kept meticulously clean despite the dusty conditions of frontier life. Sarah made a point of attending church services when the circuit preacher came through town, though she never participated in the social gatherings that followed. She contributed to community efforts, donating food for funerals, helping to raise the walls of the new schoolhouse, offering her strange but delicious stew whenever groups gathered for communal labor. These actions built a reservoir of goodwill that would later serve as a shield against suspicion. According to Martha Stiller, whose husband ran the general store, the widow purchased supplies with clockwork regularity: flour, coffee, sugar, and spices, but never meat. When questioned about this, Sarah reportedly smiled and said, "Providence provides for those who help themselves, Mrs. Stiller." The store ledger, preserved in the Ellsworth County Historical Society, confirms these purchases, the last entry dated January 15, 1868. The ledger also reveals another interesting pattern: Sarah's purchases of certain items in quantities that seemed excessive for a single woman. Salt, in particular, she bought by the barrel when most households purchased it by the pound. She also acquired unusual amounts of vinegar and black pepper, as well as special orders of chemicals like potassium nitrate, saltpeter, that the storekeeper had to source from as far away as Kansas City. At the time, these were assumed to be ingredients in her preservation methods. Only later would their role in preventing decomposition and disguising the true nature of her ingredients become apparent. The first to disappear was a drifter, name unknown. He had been seen at the Sunflower Saloon in early October 1866, spending freely and boasting of gold he'd found near Pikes Peak. The man mentioned he'd been invited to dine at the widow's place before continuing west. When questioned later, Sarah simply stated he'd enjoyed his meal and departed at dusk. No one thought much of it. Men came and went like tumbleweeds in those days. Barkeep Thomas Reed remembered the man clearly. Tall fellow, Mexican silver buttons on his vest. Said he'd struck it rich in Colorado. Bought drinks all around, then said he was headed to Topeka to deposit his findings at the bank there. Last I saw, he was headed toward the east edge of town, where the widow's place stood. Never saw him again, but that wasn't unusual. Men moved on. What Reed didn't mention until years later was that the drifter had shown him a leather pouch containing gold dust and several nuggets, wealth enough to make him a target in a place where many lived by predation. The barkeep assumed, as did most in town, that the man had fallen victim to the common hazards of frontier travel, Indians, outlaws, or simply the unforgiving environment. The possibility that he had met his end in the widow's kitchen never crossed their minds. Then came the disappearance of Chester Pike, a land surveyor working for the Kansas Pacific Railway. According to company records dated November 18, 1866, Pike had been mapping a route just north of Ellsworth when he vanished. His equipment was found near the Smoky Hill River, but of Pike himself there was no trace. The investigation concluded he had likely drowned, though his body was never recovered. Pike's role was critical to the expanding railroad. He was tasked with identifying the optimal route for the tracks, taking into account both the topography of the land and the potential for future town sites. His disappearance caused genuine concern among railway officials, who could ill afford delays in their aggressive expansion schedule. They offered a substantial reward for information about Pike's fate, but no credible leads emerged. What the official report didn't mention was that Pike had told his assistant he planned to visit the widow's place to ask permission to survey across her property. The assistant, a young man named Frederick Tanner, later recalled that Pike had spoken admiringly of Sarah Hollander, describing her as a woman of considerable refinement out of place in this rough country. Tanner was the last person known to have seen Pike alive. The surveyor's disappearance caused some stir as he represented the railroad, the lifeblood of the growing community. A search party combed the area around the Smoky Hill River for 3 days. Sarah Hollander joined the effort, bringing food for the searchers, her famous stew, which the men gratefully consumed as they rested from their labors. According to an account in the Ellsworth Messenger, dated November 22, 1866, she was a picture of concern, offering both sustenance and prayers for the missing man's safe return. This pattern of Sarah ingratiating herself with those searching for the very people she had killed would repeat throughout her time in Ellsworth. It displayed not just audacity, but a psychological insight that allowed her to hide in plain sight. By participating in these community efforts, she not only appeared above suspicion, but was able to monitor the investigations and steer them away from her cabin. By the summer of 1867, a pattern had begun to emerge, though few connected the disparate threads. 3 more men had vanished in the vicinity of Ellsworth: a cattle driver named Emmett Walsh, a peddler whose wagon was found abandoned on the trail, and a young Easterner traveling to Denver. In each case, the last known sighting placed them near or at the widow Hollander's cabin. Yet in the chaos of frontier life, with its violence and transient population, these disappearances raised few alarms. The cattle driver, Emmett Walsh, had been part of a herd being driven from Texas to Abilene. He had separated from his companions to visit Ellsworth, promising to rejoin them within 2 days. When he failed to return, his comrades initially assumed he had fallen into the temptations of town life, saloons, gambling, or women. Only when they received their pay after the cattle sale and Walsh's share remained unclaimed did they report his absence to authorities. The peddler, identified in later records as Abraham Weiss, had been traveling a regular route through the Kansas settlements, selling tools, fabric, and other goods from his wagon. His absence was noted only when customers along his established path reported that he had failed to make his usual appearances. A farmer eventually found his wagon, the horse dead in its traces, about 3 miles from the widow's property. The Easterner, Henry Abrams, according to hotel records, was a young man from Boston traveling west to seek opportunity in the Colorado mining camps. He had stayed one night at the Ellsworth Hotel, where he mentioned to the proprietor that he had been invited to dine with a most unusual lady before continuing his journey. His luggage was found a week later, abandoned beside the trail leading west from town. The cattle driver's absence was noted only when his employer, having sold the herd, found himself unable to pay Walsh his share. The peddler might have gone completely unremarked had a local farmer not found his wagon, the horse still in harness but dead from dehydration, the merchandise untouched. The Easterner became just another name on the long list of those who set out for the frontier and were never heard from again. None of these disappearances, viewed individually, would have raised significant suspicion in a place and time where life was cheap, and death came in countless forms. It was only in retrospect, after the discoveries at the widow's cabin, that the pattern became clear and chilling. It was Marshal James Kenner who first began to suspect something was amiss. Appointed to bring law to the growing settlement, Kenner was methodical in a way unusual for frontier lawmen. He began keeping a journal in September 1867, portions of which were discovered decades later during renovations to the old jailhouse. In an entry dated October 12th, he wrote, "Have dined twice now at the widow's table. Food extraordinary, but something in her manner unsettles. She speaks of her departed husband with no emotion. Asked about his regiment. Details vague." Kenner had come to Ellsworth with an unusual background for a frontier lawman. Born in Pennsylvania to a family of some means, he had received a formal education before joining the Union Army at the outbreak of the Civil War. He served with distinction in the 83rd Pennsylvania Infantry, seeing action at Gettysburg and throughout Grant's overland campaign. The war had honed his natural tendency toward careful observation, teaching him to notice details that others might miss. After the war, like many restless veterans, he had drifted west, eventually accepting the position of marshal in Ellsworth when the town council decided they needed a more formal authority than the ad hoc vigilance committees that had previously kept a rough sort of order. His military background gave him credibility, while his education set him apart from the typical frontier lawman who relied more on intimidation than investigation. Kenner was no stranger to the violence of the frontier. Born in Pennsylvania, he had served with distinction in the Union Army before taking up the badge in the turbulent post-war years. His journal reveals a man of keen observation and quiet determination. "There is something wrong about the widow," he wrote on November 3, 1867. "Too many men pass her way and continue no further. Yet she arouses no suspicion. Indeed, she seems to cultivate goodwill in the community with strategic generosity." That generosity took many forms. When influenza swept through Ellsworth in the winter of 1867, Sarah was among those who tended the sick, bringing her nourishing stew to afflicted families. The local doctor, Elias Graham, noted in his records that patients who consumed the widow's broth seemed to recover more quickly than others. "There is some property in Mrs. Hollander's concoction that imparts remarkable strength," he wrote to a colleague in Topeka. "I have asked for her recipe, but she insists it is a family secret." The irony of this observation would only become apparent later. The strength imparted by Sarah's stew likely came from the high protein content of its human ingredients, while the rapid recovery of patients might have been attributable to the opium derivatives she included in the broth, which would have eased pain and induced restful sleep. Dr. Graham himself was an interesting figure in the Ellsworth community. Trained at Jefferson Medical College in Philadelphia, he had come west after the war seeking both opportunity and escape from personal tragedy, the death of his wife and infant son in a diphtheria epidemic. Unlike many frontier doctors with dubious credentials, Graham was a legitimate physician with formal training, though his knowledge was limited by the primitive state of medical science in the 1860s. His relationship with Sarah Hollander appears to have been primarily professional. She occasionally sought treatment for minor ailments, and he admired her nursing skills during the influenza outbreak. His medical records, preserved in the University of Kansas archives, contain several references to the widow, all suggesting respect rather than suspicion. This respect may explain why, when finally confronted with the horrors in her cellar, his clinical response was so detailed, professional curiosity temporarily overriding the natural human revulsion. The marshal's suspicions grew when he noted that the widow's livestock consisted of only a few chickens and a milk cow, insufficient to provide the quantity of meat she seemed to always have on hand. Game was plentiful in the area, but Sarah was never seen hunting. According to Martha Stiller, who occasionally assisted with laundry, the widow possessed no firearms, save a small derringer she kept for protection. The woman doesn't even have a proper hunting knife, Marshal Kenner wrote in December 1867. Yet her stew is rich with meat, not game, but something else, too tender for beef, too mild for venison. When questioned, she speaks of a supplier from the South, but no such trader has been observed visiting her property. This observation highlights one of the core mysteries of the case. How did Sarah Hollander, a seemingly genteel widow without hunting skills, maintain a constant supply of meat on a frontier where food security was a daily challenge? The answer, when it finally came to light, would shake even the most hardened frontiersmen to their core. Kenner began to watch the widow's cabin more closely. His journal records that on December 18th, he positioned himself on a ridge overlooking her property from sundown until midnight. No visitors, he wrote, but twice she emerged to visit the shed behind the cabin, carrying something heavy each time she returned to the house. The smell from her chimney tonight is particularly strong. The shed in question was a small structure about 30 yards behind the main cabin, partially concealed by a stand of cottonwood trees. According to the property deed, it had been built as a smokehouse by the previous owner, though Sarah apparently used it for storage. Later investigation would reveal that the shed had a false floor concealing a small root cellar where Sarah kept particular cuts of meat during the initial aging process before transferring them to the main cellar beneath the cabin for final processing. The marshal's investigation continued through the Christmas season of 1867. Ellsworth celebrated with unusual enthusiasm that year, the prosperity brought by the railroad evident in the elaborate decorations and generous gift-giving. Sarah Hollander contributed a large pot of her stew to the town celebration, held in the newly constructed town hall. Everyone partook except Marshal Kenner, who claimed an upset stomach. He observed, however, that the widow ate her own cooking with apparent relish. This detail, that Sarah consumed her own horrific concoctions, adds another disturbing dimension to the case. Unlike many killers who are driven by rage, revenge, or sadism, the widow appears to have viewed her activities through an almost utilitarian lens. Human flesh was simply another resource to be harvested and utilized. This cold pragmatism makes her case particularly chilling, suggesting a mind that had stepped entirely outside normal human moral constraints. As the new year began, Kenner intensified his scrutiny. He sent inquiries to Ohio regarding Sarah's background, though the slow pace of winter mail meant responses would be months in coming. He began to question travelers passing through Ellsworth, specifically asking if they had encountered a woman matching Sarah's description elsewhere in their journeys. One such traveler, a drummer named Wilson Howard, provided an intriguing lead. A woman like that, you say, tall, handsome in a severe way, with those strange, pale eyes? I believe I met such a woman in Missouri, near Independence, back in '62 or '63. Called herself Mrs. Bennett then, ran a boarding house for soldiers on furlough, place burned down under mysterious circumstances, several patrons unaccounted for afterward, never proven, but there were rumors. This testimony, recorded in Kenner's journal on January 8, 1868, represents one of the few potential insights into Sarah Hollander's activities before her arrival in Ellsworth. If Howard's recollection was accurate, It suggests that the widow had been practicing her grim harvest for at least 5 years, possibly beginning during the chaos of the Civil War, when disappeared soldiers could easily be attributed to battlefield deaths. Independence, Missouri, had indeed experienced several mysterious fires during the war years, as it changed hands multiple times between Union and Confederate forces. Records from that period are spotty at best, but the Jackson County Historical Society archives do contain a brief mention of a boarding house fire in February 1863, with the proprietress listed only as Mrs. B being among those presumed dead. Clearly, this presumption was incorrect if the woman in question was indeed Sarah Hollander. The turn came in January 1868. A severe blizzard had isolated Ellsworth for nearly a week. When the trails finally cleared, Marshal Kenner rode out to check on outlying homesteads. At the widow's cabin, he found smoke rising as always, but no response to his knock. The door was unlocked, unusual in itself on the frontier. Inside, the cabin was meticulously clean, the stew pot bubbling over the fire as if recently tended. But of Sarah Hollander, there was no sign. The blizzard had been particularly fierce, even by Kansas standards. Beginning on January 16th, it had dumped nearly 3 feet of snow in 48 hours, with temperatures dropping to 20 degrees below zero. Drifts had sealed doors and windows, livestock had frozen in their pens, and several residents of outlying areas had perished attempting to reach their barns or outbuildings. That Sarah had maintained her fire throughout this ordeal suggested she had prepared well for winter, or perhaps had a particularly pressing need to keep her cooking pot active despite the conditions. In the Marshal's journal entry of January 23, 1868, he wrote simply, "Found cellar beneath loose floorboards, contents disturbing, sent for Dr. Graham." The cellar was accessed through a trapdoor concealed under a rug in the main room. Crude steps led down into darkness that Kenner's lantern barely penetrated. The space below was larger than one might expect, the full footprint of the cabin with walls of fitted stone and a packed earth floor. The air was cold and damp, with a sweetish odor that the Marshal would later describe as the smell of a slaughterhouse, but with something else beneath it, something sickly and corrupt. What Kenner discovered in that root cellar has been the subject of speculation for generations. The official report, filed with the Territorial Governor's Office and preserved in the Kansas Historical Society archives, is clinical in its brevity. It mentions human remains and evidence of butchery, but provides few specifics. Dr. Graham's medical examination notes which accompanied the report were more explicit, describing systematic dismemberment and removal of flesh from bone with considerable skill. The cellar contained the remains of at least 7 individuals, though the exact number was impossible to determine. Tools hanging on the wall, cleavers, bone saws, and hooks, were consistent with those used by butchers. A large stone table dominated the center of the space, its surface stained dark despite evidence of regular scrubbing. The table bore distinctive grooves channeling toward one end, where a bucket could be placed to catch blood and other fluids, a design similar to those used in slaughterhouses of the period. Nearby stood a large iron pot for boiling bones to extract marrow, and a variety of containers holding preserved parts in brine solutions. The organization of the space suggested not frenzied killing, but methodical processing, more abattoir than murder scene. Most disturbing was the journal found wrapped in oilcloth beneath Sarah's bed. Written in a neat feminine hand, it contained not just recipes but detailed observations on the quality of different cuts and the flavor profiles of various individuals based on age, health, and occupation. The final entry, dated January 20, 1868, read, "Marshal growing too curious, inconvenient, but should provide excellent stock for winter stew, lean but well-muscled." The journal provided a horrifying glimpse into the widow's methodology. She selected her victims carefully, men traveling alone without local connections, preferably those who had some wealth that could be appropriated after their demise. She would invite them to dine, serving a stew laced with an extract of what she called sleep flowers, likely opium poppies that she cultivated in a small greenhouse attached to the rear of the cabin. Once the victim was insensate, she would drag them to the cellar where the butchery took place. Nothing was wasted. Valuables were carefully inventoried and stored, clothing was either kept or burned, depending on quality, and the flesh went into the pot, while bones were either processed for the marrow or disposed of in a ravine behind the property. Most chilling were the casual observations scattered throughout the journal. The cattle driver was tough and gamey. Too much sun and cheap whiskey in his diet, one entry noted. The surveyor, however, was excellent. Educated men who take regular meals provide the finest flavor. Must seek out more of his type. The journal also contained detailed instructions for processing different parts of the human body, with notes on optimal cooking times, preferred spices, and appropriate accompaniments. Some entries suggested experimentation with different preservation methods, including smoking, salting, and pickling. The level of detail and the dispassionate tone suggest not just murderous intent, but a grotesque culinary interest, as if Sarah viewed her victims not as humans, but as ingredients to be perfected. Of the widow herself, no trace was ever found. A description was circulated throughout Kansas and neighboring territories. A woman of about 40, tall and straight-backed, with auburn hair streaked with gray and unusually pale blue eyes. Reports came in from as far away as Denver and Wichita of a woman matching that description, but none were confirmed. In February 1868, a stagecoach driver reported picking up a woman resembling Sarah outside of Salina, bound for Kansas City. He noted that she carried only a single carpet bag, but paid for her passage with a gold pocket watch that he recognized as similar to one owned by the missing surveyor, Chester Pike. By the time this information reached Marshal Kenner, the trail was cold. The case took an even stranger turn when authorities attempted to verify Sarah Hollander's background. Letters to Ohio revealed no record of a Sarah Hollander married to a Union soldier from that state. The photograph she had displayed of her husband in uniform was eventually identified as that of Colonel James Terrell, who had indeed fallen at Petersburg, but had been a bachelor with no known connection to the woman calling herself Sarah Hollander. Further investigation revealed other discrepancies. The deed to the cabin, which Sarah had presented when purchasing the property, bore a seal from a notary in Cincinnati that proved to be a forgery. The money she used, gold double eagles minted in San Francisco, had been reported stolen from a bank in St. Joseph, Missouri, in 1864. The alias she had chosen, Hollander, appeared to be taken from a tombstone in a small cemetery outside Ellsworth, that of an infant who had died in 1859. This pattern of appropriating identities from the dead would later be recognized as a recurring element in Sarah's movements. In each location where she was suspected of operating, local records revealed similar inconsistencies, names taken from tombstones, documentation with subtle but significant forgeries, and financial resources that appeared suddenly with no clear origin. She displayed a remarkable ability to create convincing personas that raised few questions in communities accustomed to reinvention and scant documentation. As winter gave way to spring, another disturbing discovery was made. Behind the cabin at the edge of the property where the prairie began to slope toward a small creek, searchers found a boneyard. Mixed among obvious animal remains were human bones, weathered and scattered by scavengers. According to Dr. Graham's supplementary report, filed in March 1868, these remains suggested that the widow's activities had begun well before her arrival in Ellsworth. Graham's examination of these remains yielded troubling insights. Many of the bones show evidence of being boiled, he wrote, consistent with the extraction of marrow. Others bear the marks of saw and cleaver. Most disturbing are the skulls, 5 in total, which have been opened with surprising precision, the brain case accessed as one might remove the top of a boiled egg. The boneyard findings expanded the estimated victim count significantly. Based on the number of identifiable remains, Graham concluded that at least 15 individuals had met their end at the widow's hands in Ellsworth alone. If reports of her activities elsewhere were accurate, the total could be far higher. The discovery of the boneyard caused a sensation in Ellsworth, transforming what might have remained a local horror into a story that spread across the country. Newspapers as far away as New York and San Francisco carried accounts of the Kansas cannibal, though many embellished the already gruesome facts with sensational details. The New York Herald, in particular, ran a series of articles speculating on Sarah's background, suggesting variously that she was a European aristocrat, a victim of the Donner Party who had acquired a taste for human flesh during that ordeal, or even a member of a secret cult dedicated to anthropophagy. The story might have ended there, a macabre but isolated incident in the violent history of the frontier. However, in July 1868, a fire destroyed much of downtown Ellsworth, including the marshal's office, where evidence from the case was stored. The blaze was ruled accidental, attributed to a lightning strike, but some questioned the timing. The fire began shortly after midnight on July 12th, during a summer thunderstorm. It started in the livery stable, but quickly spread to adjacent wooden structures, consuming nearly 2 blocks of the business district before it was contained. Among the buildings destroyed was the town hall, which housed both the marshal's office and the makeshift jail. The evidence from the Hollander case, including the journal, tools, and preserved specimens that had been removed from the cellar, was entirely lost. In the aftermath of the fire, rumors began to circulate that the widow had been seen watching from the hillside as the town burned. Station Master Theodore Wilkins reported that a woman resembling Sarah Hollander had purchased a ticket to St. Louis the day before the fire, paying with gold coins. The conductor who worked that route confirmed that such a woman had boarded in Ellsworth but had disembarked at a water stop before reaching Kansas City. From there, the trail went cold. The timing of the fire and the reported sighting raised the disturbing possibility that Sarah had returned specifically to destroy the evidence of her crimes, suggesting both a calculating intelligence and a boldness that bordered on recklessness. If true, it indicates that the widow viewed her activities not as isolated incidents, but as an ongoing enterprise that she intended to continue elsewhere, necessitating the elimination of anything that might connect her new identity to her past actions. The widow's cabin remained abandoned, its reputation ensuring that even land-hungry settlers gave it a wide berth. In the spring of 1869, another fire, this one definitely intentional, reduced the structure to ashes. No one claimed responsibility, but no investigation was pursued either. The land was eventually reclaimed by the prairie, the location marked only by a few stones from the foundation, and the abnormal richness of the grass that grew there, fertilized by what lay beneath. Local farmers reported that nothing planted on that spot would grow properly. Wheat would emerge stunted and discolored, corn would produce misshapen ears, and even wildflowers seemed to avoid the area. Cattle and horses refused to graze there, becoming agitated when driven near the former site of the cabin. These observations, while possibly attributable to natural soil conditions or the psychological effect of knowing what had occurred there, added to the growing mythology surrounding the case. The case of Sarah Hollander faded from official records, becoming instead a whispered story told around campfires. Parents used it to warn children not to wander too far from home or accept food from strangers. In saloons up and down the Kansas Pacific line, men would sometimes refuse a bowl of stew with a nervous laugh and a reference to the widow's recipe. But the story didn't end with the burning of the cabin. Over the subsequent decades, reports surfaced periodically of a woman matching Sarah's description appearing in various locations across the West, always in the wake of mysterious disappearances. In 1872, a boarding house in Cheyenne reported that 6 guests had vanished over a 2-month period, their rooms found empty, but with no indication of departure. The proprietress, a widow who had arrived from the East just before the disappearances began, herself vanished when authorities came to question her. Descriptions matched Sarah Hollander, though the woman called herself Margaret Wilson in Cheyenne. The Cheyenne incident is particularly well documented, as it coincided with the construction of the Union Pacific Railroad through Wyoming Territory. Among those who disappeared was a telegraph operator named Silas Harmon, whose employer, the Western Union Telegraph Company, conducted a thorough investigation. Their records, preserved in the company archives, include interviews with other boarders who described Mrs. Wilson as an excellent cook who served a distinctive stew that made them sleep like the dead. The report also notes that several of the missing men had been carrying substantial sums of money, all of which disappeared with them. 3 years later, in a mining camp near Deadwood, 3 prospectors went missing after attending a dinner hosted by a new arrival, a tall woman with pale eyes who had opened a small restaurant catering to miners. By the time suspicions arose, she had moved on, leaving behind only a carefully cleaned kitchen and a root cellar that the remaining miners refused to fully explore, sealing it instead with dynamite. The Deadwood incident occurred during the initial gold rush to the Black Hills, a period of chaotic growth and minimal law enforcement. The woman in question, who called herself Elizabeth Palmer, had arrived in the spring of 1875 and established a small eatery in a tent near the main diggings. Miners appreciated her cooking, particularly during the harsh conditions of early settlement, when most ate little besides beans and bacon. The disappearances might have gone unnoticed entirely had the 3 prospectors not been partners who had recently discovered a promising claim. According to accounts in the Black Hills Pioneer, the miners became suspicious only when they entered Palmer's tent after her departure and discovered a trap door leading to a cellar dug into the hillside. They descended far enough to observe what one described as a butcher's workshop, but not for any animal I know, before retreating in horror and collapsing the entrance with explosives. The newspaper account mentions tools of suspicious nature and stains that appeared to be blood, but provides few specific details, likely due to the reluctance of witnesses to fully describe what they had seen. In 1881, a physician in Santa Fe documented treating a woman for burns on her hands. Injuries, she claimed, came from a cooking accident. He noted that despite her obvious pain, the woman seemed unusually interested in his medical equipment, asking detailed questions about his surgical saws and bone-cutting implements. The next day, both the woman and the doctor's surgical kit had disappeared. The doctor's description of the woman aligned closely with that of Sarah Hollander. This incident is recorded in the memoirs of Dr. Lawrence Miller, published in 1900 under the title 30 Years of Frontier Physician. Miller describes the woman, who gave her name as Catherine Wild, as tall and commanding, with striking blue eyes that seemed to evaluate everything around her with clinical detachment. He notes that her burns were consistent with her story of a cooking accident, but that there was something in her manner that unsettled me, a peculiar intensity when she examined my surgical implements, asking questions about their use with knowledge that seemed beyond casual interest. Miller reports that when he arrived at his office the following morning, he found the door unlocked, though he was certain he had secured it. His most precise surgical tools, bone saws, cutting implements, and a set of knives he used for amputations, were missing. So too was his patient ledger for the previous month, containing the names and addresses of those he had treated. Most disturbing of all, when he went to report the theft to local authorities, he learned that a rooming house on the outskirts of town had burned to the ground overnight, with the landlady and 2 boarders unaccounted for. Perhaps the most compelling evidence came from Tucson in 1887. A photographer named Samuel Elkins captured an image of a crowd gathered for a territorial fair. At the edge of the frame stood a woman whose features, when the photograph was later enhanced, bore a striking resemblance to the known descriptions of Sarah. More tellingly, records from the same period noted the disappearance of 3 men who had been staying at a boarding house run by a woman matching Sarah's description. The boarding house itself burned to the ground shortly after the disappearances were reported. The Tucson incident gains additional significance from the fact that one of the missing men, Edward Hollister, was a journalist researching a story on unsolved disappearances in Western territories. According to his publisher, Hollister had been developing a theory that a single individual might be responsible for dozens of vanishings along the frontier. His notes, which he regularly mailed back to his newspaper in St. Louis, had mentioned a pattern of missing persons cases following the arrival of a widow who established boarding houses or small restaurants in growing communities. Hollister's last communication, dated September 14, 1887, mentioned that he had taken a room at a boarding house run by a Mrs. Gray on the outskirts of Tucson, where he intended to observe the proprietress whom he suspected might be connected to his investigation. 3 days later, the boarding house burned, and Hollister was never heard from again. His newspaper published his theories posthumously, creating the first public suggestion that Sarah Hollander might be a serial predator operating across multiple states and territories. The photograph taken by Samuel Elkins remains one of the few potential images of the widow in existence. Though the quality is poor by modern standards, it shows a tall woman in dark clothing standing slightly apart from the main crowd at the fair. Her face is partially turned away from the camera, but what is visible matches the descriptions provided by Ellsworth witnesses: high cheekbones, a straight nose, and most distinctively, pale eyes that seem to catch the light in an unusual way. In 1892, an elderly woman died in a boarding house in Leavenworth. Among her few possessions was found a journal containing recipes and observations eerily similar to those discovered in the widow's cabin. The landlady reported that the woman, who had given her name as Mary Sutton, had been a quiet tenant who kept to herself, but occasionally prepared meals for other boarders that were praised for their unique flavor. Before authorities could investigate further, the boarding house burned to the ground, destroying any evidence that might have connected Mary Sutton to Sarah Hollander. The Leavenworth incident is particularly intriguing because it represents one of the few occasions where a woman potentially identified as Sarah died before disappearing. According to the death certificate filed with county authorities, Mary Sutton succumbed to pneumonia after a brief illness, with the local doctor signing off on the cause of death without apparent suspicion. The landlady, Elizabeth Porter, later told investigators that Sutton had been a resident for nearly a year, paying her rent promptly and causing no trouble. What made authorities suspicious was Porter's mention of the journal she had discovered while cleaning out Sutton's room after her death. She described it as containing recipes of an unusual nature and observations about the eating habits of various types of people. Before she could turn it over to the sheriff, however, the boarding house caught fire, apparently due to a lamp overturning in the vacant room that had belonged to Sutton. Porter escaped with minor burns, but lost everything in the blaze, including the journal and any other evidence that might have connected Mary Sutton to the widow Hollander. Some historians have suggested that this might have been Sarah's final location, that she had genuinely died in Leavenworth, and the fire was a coincidence rather than a deliberate attempt to conceal evidence. Others propose a more sinister theory, that Mary Sutton was yet another victim, her identity appropriated by Sarah after her death, with the widow herself setting the fire before moving on to a new location and a new name. The most credible sighting came in 1898, when a photographer in Dodge City captured an image of a crowd gathered for a hanging. Among the onlookers was a tall woman in dark clothing, whose features, though aged, bore a striking resemblance to the descriptions of Sarah Hollander. By the time this was noticed, the woman had vanished. The Dodge City photograph is particularly significant because of its clarity and the context in which it was taken. The execution being witnessed was that of William Hendricks, convicted of murdering and dismembering 3 cowboys on his remote ranch southwest of town. The case had drawn considerable attention due to its gruesome nature, Hendricks had not only killed his victims, but had processed their bodies in a manner reminiscent of butchering livestock, leading to inevitable comparisons with the Ellsworth case from 3 decades earlier. The presence of a woman resembling an aged Sarah Hollander at this execution suggests either a morbid curiosity about a crime similar to her own, or, more disturbingly, a desire to witness the consequences she herself had thus far escaped. The photographer, Joseph Miller, noted in his journal that he had been struck by the woman's intense focus on the proceedings and her lack of the typical feminine reaction to such a grisly spectacle. "Unlike other ladies present," he wrote, "who covered their eyes or turned away at the crucial moment, this woman watched with an expression I can only describe as evaluative, as if she were taking mental notes on the entire procedure." What makes the case of the widow Hollander particularly disturbing is not just the nature of her crimes, but how effectively she exploited the vulnerabilities of frontier society. In a place where disappearances were common and questions few, where hunger was a constant companion and hospitality a sacred trust, she found perfect hunting grounds. Her victims, primarily men traveling alone, were unlikely to be immediately missed, their absence attributed to the countless dangers of the trail. The frontier of the 1860s and 1870s was a landscape of transience and reinvention. Men and women arrived in new settlements with little more than their word regarding their past. Documentation was scarce, communication between distant locations was slow and unreliable, and the constant movement of population made tracking individuals nearly impossible. In this environment, Sarah Hollander was able to establish credibility through confidence and careful attention to the details of her fabricated background. Moreover, the position she chose, that of a widow, was particularly effective. Widows were common in post-Civil War America, especially in Western territories where men outnumbered women significantly and mortality rates were high. A widow was an object of sympathy rather than suspicion, often granted a degree of independence unusual for women of the era. Sarah leveraged this status masterfully, presenting herself as simultaneously vulnerable enough to evoke protection and self-sufficient enough to avoid close scrutiny. The psychological implications are perhaps most unsettling. According to fragments of her journal that survived the Ellsworth fire, Sarah did not view her actions as murder, but as a form of husbandry. She wrote of harvesting rather than killing, describing her victims with the dispassionate eye of a farmer assessing livestock. There was no evident sadism in her writings, no pleasure taken in suffering, only a cold pragmatism that is, in its way, more chilling than rage or hatred. One entry dated December 1867 stands out for its matter-of-fact tone. The peddler lasted nearly 2 weeks. Efficient use extends resources. The liver was particularly fine. Must remember to soak in milk before cooking to remove the bitter taste. The brain, disappointing. Perhaps age is a factor. This clinical detachment suggests a mind operating outside normal human moral constraints. Unlike many killers who are driven by emotional impulses, rage, jealousy, fear, or sexual compulsion, Sarah appears to have viewed her activities as simply practical. In a frontier environment where resources were scarce and survival often precarious, she had concluded that humans were a viable food source, distinguishable from animals only by the social taboo against consuming them, a taboo she had evidently abandoned. Professor James Halloway of the University of Kansas, who studied the case extensively in the 1950s, suggested that Sarah Hollander represented a rare psychological profile, a female predator who killed not from passion or avarice, but from a distorted sense of practicality. She saw humans as resources, Halloway wrote, no different from cattle or hogs. In the context of frontier subsistence, her behavior, while monstrous, had its own internal logic. Halloway's analysis, published in the Journal of Criminal Psychology in 1957, draws parallels between the widow Hollander case and other historical instances of survival cannibalism, such as the Donner Party incident of 1846-1847. He suggests that Sarah may have experienced a traumatic event involving extreme hunger that destroyed the natural taboo against consuming human flesh. Once this barrier was breached, he theorizes, she developed a rationalized system for continuing the practice even when survival no longer depended on it. This assessment gains credence from the methodical nature of her activities. The cellar beneath her cabin was not a chamber of horrors, but a workroom, organized, efficient, and maintained with scrupulous cleanliness. Her journal entries focused not on the act of killing, but on the quality of the resulting product. She was, in essence, a farmer whose crop was human flesh. The question of Sarah Hollander's origins remains one of the most intriguing aspects of the case. Who was she before she appeared in Ellsworth? The false background she constructed, the non-existent husband, the fabricated Ohio connections, suggests a calculated effort to create a persona that would arouse sympathy rather than suspicion. Some historians have theorized that she may have begun her activities during the Civil War, when the chaos of conflict and the massive displacement of populations would have provided ample cover for her predations. The report from Wilson Howard placing a similar woman in Independence, Missouri during the war years lends weight to this theory. The Civil War created unprecedented conditions of social disruption and scarcity. Thousands of soldiers went missing, their fates often unknown to their families. Refugees streamed along roads and gathered in camps where disease and hunger were constant companions. In this environment, a predator like Sarah could operate with minimal risk of detection, particularly if she targeted those already on the margins, deserters, displaced civilians, or the wounded separated from their units. Others suggest her origins may have been even more distant. An intriguing note in Marshall Kenner's journal mentions that Sarah spoke occasionally of Europe, displaying knowledge of London and Paris that seemed firsthand. Could she have brought her horrific practices across the Atlantic, fleeing discovery in the Old World to find new hunting grounds in the New? This theory gained support from the discovery, in 1962, of a newspaper article from the Liverpool Mercury dated August 1859, describing the disappearance of several lodgers from a boarding house in the dockside area of the city. The proprietress, whose name is given only as Mrs. S., vanished shortly before authorities could question her. The description provided, a tall woman of about 30 years, with unusually light eyes and a refined manner of speech, is tantalizingly similar to later descriptions of Sarah Hollander. If this connection is valid, it suggests that Sarah's activities spanned at least 4 decades and 2 continents, a reign of predation almost unprecedented in the annals of crime. It also indicates a level of planning and adaptation that speaks to a formidable intelligence, however twisted in its application. The case remains officially unsolved. No cemetery in Kansas bears the name Sarah Hollander, no prison record accounts for her incarceration, no certain evidence confirms her death. Like many frontier mysteries, it has become part of the complex tapestry of Western mythology, a dark thread among the more celebrated tales of cowboys and outlaws. In 1957, during construction of a highway bypass near the original site of the widow's cabin, workers uncovered a cache of human bones. Analysis suggested they dated from the appropriate time period, but no definitive connection to the Hollander case could be established. The remains were quietly interred in the Ellsworth Cemetery, marked only with a small stone bearing the inscription, Unknown, 1868. The discovery occurred during the cutting of a roadbed through a small rise about 200 yards from where the cabin had stood. Workers initially assumed they had encountered an unmarked Indian burial ground, a common occurrence in Kansas. However, examination by archaeologists from the University of Kansas revealed that the remains were not consistent with Native American burial practices. Instead, they showed signs of having been processed in a manner similar to those described in Dr. Graham's original report: cut marks from sharp implements, evidence of boiling or cooking, and deliberate breaking to access marrow. Carbon dating placed the remains within the appropriate time frame for the widow's activities in Ellsworth, but without DNA testing, unavailable at that time, no conclusive link could be established to specific missing persons. The highway construction proceeded after the remains were removed, with most workers unaware of the grim history they were paving over. More recently, in 2003, renovations to one of the oldest buildings in Leavenworth revealed a hidden space between walls containing personal effects that may have belonged to the woman known as Mary Sutton, the possible final identity of Sarah Hollander. Among these items was a corroded locket containing a daguerreotype of a young woman whose features bore some resemblance to descriptions of Sarah in her younger days. The reverse was inscribed with the initials E.L. and the date 1847. Attempts to trace these initials through historical records have thus far proved fruitless. The hidden cache also contained several small vials of what appeared to be dried herbs, a set of unusually fine bone-handled cutting implements wrapped in oilcloth, and, most intriguingly, a small notebook containing what appeared to be recipes written in a cipher. Forensic analysis of the handwriting suggested similarities to the fragmentary journal entries recovered from the Ellsworth cabin, though the passage of time and the poor preservation of the earlier samples made definitive comparison impossible. The settlement where Sarah Hollander once served her infamous stew has grown into a small city. Few of its current residents know the story of the widow, and those who do regard it as little more than a colorful local legend, embellished over generations. The actual site of her cabin lies beneath a highway interchange, the land's bloody history paved over with concrete and progress. Modern Ellsworth bears little resemblance to the frontier settlement of 1868. The railroad that once brought cattle and commerce now carries primarily grain and manufactured goods. The downtown area has been partially restored to evoke its frontier past, though with an emphasis on the more palatable aspects of Western history: the cowboys, the cattle drives, the pioneer spirit. The darker elements, including the Widow Hollander case, receive little official acknowledgement. The Kansas Historical Society maintains a small exhibit on the case in its museum in Topeka, presenting it as an example of frontier justice and early forensic investigation rather than dwelling on the more gruesome details. The display includes a replica of Marshall Kenner's badge, photographs of Ellsworth from the period, and a carefully worded description of the events that presents them as a solved historical mystery rather than an ongoing enigma. Yet something of the story lingers, persistent as the smell of wood smoke on a still prairie evening. Every few years, usually during particularly harsh winters, rumors circulate of a tall, gray-haired woman seen at the edges of isolated farms, requesting shelter. Food disappears from outbuildings. Strange tracks lead across snow-covered fields and vanish at the roadside. These modern sightings are easily dismissed as the natural recycling of folklore, the tendency of communities to resurrect their monsters during times of stress or uncertainty. Psychologists suggest that such stories serve a social purpose, reinforcing community bonds through shared fear, providing a cautionary tale about the dangers of trusting strangers, or simply offering the thrill of controlled terror in otherwise mundane surroundings. And occasionally, in the oldest part of town, residents report catching a brief whiff of an unusual aroma, rich and savory, yet with an underlying odor that makes them quicken their steps toward the comfort and safety of well-lit homes. This sensory element of the legend speaks to the primal nature of the taboo Sarah violated. Food is central to human culture and community. We gather around tables, share meals, and use the breaking of bread as a symbol of trust and fellowship. The widow perverted this fundamental social bond, transforming an act of nurturing into one of predation. The lingering scent in local folklore represents not just the physical reality of her cooking pot, but the psychological stain her actions left on the community's collective memory. Local folklore has attached itself to the widow's legacy, Some claim that eating at a restaurant housed in any building constructed over the path where Sarah once walked will result in illness or bad luck. Others insist that on particularly cold January nights, the sound of a cleaver can be heard echoing from the site where her cabin once stood. These superstitions extend to specific practices as well. Old-timers in Ellsworth reportedly refuse to eat stew served by strangers, particularly during winter months. Some families maintain the tradition of always preparing their own food when traveling rather than accepting hospitality from those they do not know well. And many local recipes specifically avoid the combination of ingredients that Sarah was known to favor in her infamous concoction, certain herbs and spices that, when detected, might trigger uncomfortable associations. Skeptics dismiss these stories as typical frontier superstition, no different from the countless ghost tales that haunt small towns across America. Yet there is something about the Hollander case that resonates differently, perhaps because it lacks the supernatural elements that make other legends easy to dismiss. There were no ghosts in Sarah's cellar, no curses or vengeful spirits, only the all-too-human capacity for calculated cruelty. The enduring power of the widow Hollander's story lies precisely in its plausibility. Unlike tales of haunted houses or spectral riders, the horror here is entirely mundane. A woman who looked at her fellow humans and saw only meat, a predator who used social conventions as camouflage, a killer who might have continued indefinitely had chance, and one observant lawman not exposed her activities. This reality-based terror touches deeper fears than any ghost story could reach. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of the widow Hollander case is not what we know, but what remains hidden. If the scattered bones and fragmentary records tell even half the truth, she was one of the most prolific killers in American history. And if the later sightings are to be believed, she continued her activities long after the discoveries in Ellsworth should have ended her grim harvest. The full extent of Sarah's activities may never be known. The transient nature of frontier populations, the poor record-keeping of the era, and the destruction of evidence in the Ellsworth fire have ensured that many questions remain unanswered. How many people fell victim to her predations? Did she operate continuously from the Civil War era until the turn of the century, or were there periods of dormancy? Did she work alone, or might she have had accomplices or even imitators who adopted her methods? In the vast spaces of the American frontier, where people could reinvent themselves with each westward mile, the widow found perfect camouflage. A woman alone, seemingly vulnerable, inspiring protective instincts rather than suspicion. How many paused at her table before continuing on journeys they would never complete? The true toll of her hospitality may never be known. Marshal James Kenner never fully recovered from his investigation of the Hollander case. He resigned his position in Ellsworth in the summer of 1868 and returned east, settling in Ohio. His journal entries from this period reveal a man haunted not just by what he had discovered, but by how close he himself had come to becoming another ingredient in the widow's pot. "I dined at her table twice," he wrote in his final entry concerning the case. "What was in the stew those nights? Who might I have consumed unaware?" Kenner's subsequent career was undistinguished. Records from the Cleveland Police Department show that he served as a night watchman from 1870 until his retirement in 1885, declining several opportunities for advancement. Colleagues described him as withdrawn and somber, with a particular aversion to the cooking smells from nearby restaurants. He died in 1890, leaving behind a modest estate and the journals that would later prove crucial to understanding the Hollander case. Dr. Graham continued his practice in Ellsworth until his death in 1882. His medical notes contain occasional references to patients who complained of nightmares, featuring a tall woman offering them food. He prescribed laudanum for these cases, but noted that the dreams often persisted despite medication. Graham's own relationship with the case was complicated. As a physician, he approached the discoveries in the widow's cellar with professional detachment, carefully documenting the evidence and applying what forensic knowledge was available in that era. Yet his personal writings reveal a man deeply disturbed by what he had witnessed. In a letter to a medical colleague in St. Louis, dated March 1868, he wrote, "I find myself unable to partake of meat without first ascertaining its precise origin. The widow has poisoned not just her victims, but the very act of eating itself." The land where Sarah's cabin stood remained vacant until the highway construction of the 1950s. Local farmers avoided it, claiming that crops planted there grew strangely and livestock refused to graze on its grass. A surveyor's report from 1912 noted that the soil in that precise location was unusually dark and rich compared to surrounding areas, a fact attributed to the ashes from the cabin fire, but which takes on more disturbing implications in light of what we now know was buried there. This avoidance of the site represents a form of informal quarantine, as if the land itself had been contaminated by the acts committed upon it. Similar patterns can be observed at other locations associated with profound violence or taboo violation, from battlefield sites to the grounds of former asylums or prisons. Whether driven by superstition, respect for the dead, or simply the psychological discomfort of confronting dark history, humans tend to create geographic boundaries around spaces where social norms have been severely breached. In the annals of frontier crime, the case of Sarah Hollander stands apart, not just for the nature of her crimes, but for her apparent escape from justice. While the violent men of the era, the outlaws and gunfighters whose names have become legend, often met appropriately violent ends, the widow simply vanished, possibly to continue her predations elsewhere under new identities. This aspect of the case has led some to question whether Sarah Hollander existed at all, or whether she was a composite created from various frontier disappearances and the natural human tendency to create monsters from the unknown. But the physical evidence discovered in Ellsworth, the cellar with its grim implements, the journal with its cold-blooded recipes, the boneyard with its silent testimony, argues against such skepticism. The skeptical view has been most forcefully articulated by Professor Thomas Reynolds of Kansas State University, whose 1975 book, Frontier Phantoms, suggests that the widow Hollander was largely a creation of newspaper sensationalism, built upon a foundation of actual disappearances, but embellished beyond recognition. Reynolds argues that the physical evidence from the case was insufficient to support the cannibalism allegations, and that the journal, the most damning evidence, was never independently verified before its destruction in the fire. This perspective, while offering a more comfortable alternative to the documented horror, fails to account for the consistent pattern of eyewitness testimony, the detailed medical reports of Dr. Graham, and the subsequent sightings of a woman matching Sarah's description in connection with similar disappearances across the West. The weight of evidence, fragmentary though it may be, points to a disturbing reality. The widow was real. Her stew pot bubbled on a frontier hearth filled with unimaginable ingredients. Men sat at her table, accepted her hospitality, and became part of her larder. And somewhere, perhaps, she continued this cycle long after Ellsworth had forgotten her, finding new hunting grounds as civilization pushed ever westward. The legacy of the widow Hollander extends beyond local folklore or historical curiosity. Her case represents one of the earliest documented female serial killers in American history, challenging the conventional wisdom that such predators are almost exclusively male. It offers insights into how social expectations regarding gender can provide camouflage for those who operate outside social norms. Few, in 1868, would have suspected a seemingly genteel widow of being capable of such calculated violence. Moreover, the case illuminates the particular vulnerabilities of frontier society, the isolation, the transience, the limited communication, and the scarcity that made survival itself a daily challenge. In such an environment where normal social constraints were already strained, The line between accepted violence and monstrous transgression could become blurred. The widow exploited these conditions masterfully, creating a sustained predatory enterprise in plain sight of a community too preoccupied with its own survival to notice the disappearances in its midst. The next time you find yourself on a lonely Kansas highway as darkness falls and you see a light in the distance promising warmth and shelter, perhaps you'll remember the story of Sarah Hollander. And perhaps you'll wonder, as you approach that welcoming door, what might be bubbling in the pot over the fire, and who else has been invited to dinner. The frontier is gone now, tamed by highways and cell towers, satellites and streetlights. The vast empty spaces that once allowed a predator like Sarah to disappear without trace have been filled with settlements and surveillance. Yet something of the wildness remains. In remote farmhouses, in roadside diners, where strangers gather briefly before continuing their separate journeys, in the enduring human willingness to trust the hospitality of those we do not know. It is in these spaces, these moments of vulnerability, that the ghost of the widow still lurks. Not a supernatural presence, but a cautionary memory, a reminder that darkness can wear a human face and offer you a seat at its table. The steam rising from the pot might smell delicious, but consider carefully before you lift the spoon to your lips. You might not be the guest at dinner, but an ingredient for tomorrow's stew.